Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and this is a verbal short story of fantasy adventure titled IronGrove Lumber Flow. Alright, so we join our heroes, and they are staying at the Silver Stag Inn. And our heroes, Brennan Horst, he was a human fighter, Ralna Aviri, who is a human wizard, Gorvis Arhelm, who is a dwarf cleric, and finally Zyle, who is an elf thief. Alright, and the first three are staying in the Silver Stag Inn. Zyle is in the woods. She usually does not travel with the other three, as she is a thief. She likes to hide her location as often as possible. So that morning, Ralna is down in the common room of the inn, and the innkeeper comes over to her. He sits across from her, and Ralna looks up. She notices the innkeeper sitting across from her. He's an older man, close to 50. He's clean shaven, but he has dark curly hair. He smiles, and he puts two small leather bags in front of her. And he says, I was told last evening that you were trying to get some of our freshest fruits and vegetables. Well, I have prepared these for your trip today. Ralna smiles very brightly at him and puts her hand on top of his hands and says, "Thank you so much, innkeeper. That is most appreciated." The innkeeper smiles back and he says, "I was told you are traveling to Castle Edling." And Ralna says, "Yes, that's correct. My good friend Brennan, he was recently in he actually bet everything in his backpack against the backpack of another, well, I don't want to use the term gentleman, but the two of them had fisticuffs, and Brennan, of course, won, winning the other man's backpack. But within that backpack was a map. It is one of the most detailed maps I've ever seen. It maps out 50 miles around Castle Edling. And based on the nature of the gentleman that Brennan had defeated, it was very clear to us that this map was most likely stolen. So we are returning the map to Castle Edling. All right, and the innkeeper says, "Ah," he says, "and you hope for a reward?" And Ralna says, "Well, Brennan certainly hopes for a reward. Gorvis is I think he just wants to go to court to spread the good news of Lux, the demigod of light, who he serves. And I am hoping to have some time in Castle Edling's library, where I have been told they have many historical books. I would like to learn more about our realm of Holmren." And the innkeeper nods. He sees some local villagers come in, and he immediately stands and he says, "Well, once again, Ralna, thank you for staying in our inn. Your coin is most appreciated, but not nearly as much as your company." And Ralna actually closes her spell book. She had just been finishing out a few last checks in her spell book. She thanks the innkeeper, and at that point, her and Ralna, Brennan, and Gorvis head out. Ralna throws the bags of fresh fruits and vegetables into the forest, and they go along their way along a dirt path, right? Gorvis talks to Brennan and Ralna and says, "I was speaking to one of the local villagers, and he said we could spare quite a bit of time if we take a lumber flow." He says, "There's a river just 3 miles east. If we head over, we could take the river, and we can actually," he said, "we can jump onto some of the lumber flows, the lumber that is flowed down the river, and find our way easily to Castle Edling in less than a day's travel." Right? So Ralna says, "I'm a little suspicious of that. I don't want my spell book tumbling into the waters." And so actually Brennan goes, "I don't know. Just he says, sitting on some lumber for the day, kind of riding lazily down the river sure would be nice, rather than have a whole day of travel," right? And so then at that point, Gorvis says, I know, Ralna, I can bless your spell book today, and it will make certain that no harm comes to it throughout the day, right? Ralna kind of like squints her eyes at him, but she nods, and so they head over the 3 miles toward the river. As they're waiting, they do recognize exactly what they had been told about, that there is this lumber flow. And so about every 20 minutes, they see groups of large, like the center of trees, like long 10, 20-foot trees, which have been stripped of their limbs and now are just long, almost like rods, right? And they're between 10 and 20 feet long, and every so often there'll be a larger grouping of them. So at one point, Brennan actually sees that there's a larger group of these logs coming down that are actually tied together, and there's 6 of them. So he immediately takes off all his armor, and he says to Gorvis, "You'll need to take that chain shirt off, Gorvis." Brennan then hands his wooden shield, his long sword, and his half plate to Gorvis, and then he swims out, grabs the logs, and swims them back in, and struggles, right? And struggles and brings the logs into the riverbank. Ralna and Gorvis now join him, and they grab a kind of a longer branch from close to the forest, and they kind of shove off and just begin lazily floating down the river, right? And actually, so they've been doing this for about an hour and a half, and Brennan actually, at this point, is fully lying back, just relaxing, and Gorvis says to Brennan, "Well, you were right, Brennan, this truly is wonderful." And they're just kind of enjoying the sun, and there's even a light breeze, and Ralna, shakes her head like, "Yes, this is working well," right? As they kind of just meander down the river, right? So about another half an hour goes by, and Brennan like kind of scoots over, and he grabs some of the bacon that had been sent with them from the inn. He goes into his pack. Now at this point, both Brennan and Gorvis are not wearing their armor because they're in the middle of a river, and both of them are experienced enough adventurers to know that if you have your armor on in the middle of a river, you can drown, right? So Brennan begins just chewing on this bacon when he looks ahead, and about half a mile ahead, he could see these bluffs, and he says, "Ralna, do you see movement on that bluff?" Ralna turns around, kind of lazily stretches. She's been kind of enjoying the sun as well. Gorvis looks around, and she goes, "Absolutely." She says, "I see it as well. Those are grayback goblins." Immediately, Brennan leaps to his feet, right? And he goes, "I can see the overpass. They're going to ambush us," right? And he looks over, he looks up, and he says, "How many do you suspect?" And she says, "Well, I see at least 4 to 8, but often those goblin packs, often they're 20 or 30 members deep." She says, "It's unusual to see them in a place like this. I wonder if the villages close to here are safe," right? And he says, "Well, we better take care of this quickly." And at this point, he says, "What I expect is that they'll throw rocks at us from that bluff. Could be quite dangerous," right? And he says, "Gorvis, quickly, hand me my longsword." And so, Gorvis jumps up, hands his longsword, and he says, "Ralna, prepare your spells," right? And he says, I will swim to shore, run up, and attack them on the bluff. The 2 of you, be careful. They'll be throwing stones down," right? So at that point, Brennan just turns, leaps into the river, and begins swimming it with his sword on his back as quickly as he can toward the riverbank, right? Ralna and Gorvis look at each other, and Gorvis says, "I have to go help him. Ralna, stay here on the raft. Be safe." And Ralna says, "Gorvis, you can't swim with that hammer. It's way too heavy." And he says, "Oh, you're right." He says, "Well, I'll have to say an extra prayer to Lux, the demigod of light." And she says, "Gorvis," she says, "you can't help him unarmed." and he says, "I'll show you I can." And he quickly jumps into the river, okay? As he's swimming, Ralna says, "Gorvis, when you get to the shore, I will levitate your hammer to you." And she kind of hears back his burbled answer. And so at this point, Brennan is already on the shore, and he is running pell-mell up toward the bluff. And he begins to shout. And he shouts, "Graybacks, graybacks, to me, to me!" Immediately, the hill swarms with, exactly as Ralna had said, about 25 graybacks. Half of them split off, and the other, and start heading down the hill toward Brennan, right? So now there's a dozen grayback goblins heading directly toward Brennan. Ralna begins to levitate Gorvis's hammer, silver hammer, to him, right? At this point, Gorvis, on his dwarf legs, is running as quickly as he can behind Brennan, and he looks back, kind of puts out his hand in expectation of seizing the hammer that's being moved toward him through levitation. Ralna is concentrating on her spell, and so at that point, Gorvis continues to run. Ralna levitates the hammer toward him, and Brennan is running full out toward a dozen of the grayback goblins, who now, armed with chipped swords, rusted swords, broken axes, a whole host of other ad hoc weapons, even just like gnarled clubs, are running down toward Brennan. Okay. But the other half of the goblin pack, indeed, just as expected, are now readying rocks to throw down on Ralna as she's still on the raft. Okay. So as this is as Brennan runs and crashes directly into all 12 of the grayback pack. He hurdles himself, throwing himself at 4 grayback goblins directly, and immediately crashes into them, knocks them all onto the ground, and then stands back up and swings his longsword in a big arc. Right, he strikes 3 of the grayback goblins, while 4 of the other ones are still down on the ground, scrabbling to get back up from his initial strike. One of the grayback goblins turns and brings a chipped axe and just slams it right into his shin. Right, it barks against his shin, and Brennan cries out in pain and takes a step back. 2 of the other goblins jump on top of him, right, and begin to pull out rusty daggers and begin to stab down into his torso. Brennan actually, he continues to howl in pain as the goblins begin to kind of pile on top of him. At the same time, Gorvis, with his silver hammer, having pushed his small dwarven legs to their absolute limit, crashes into the pack who is now dogpiling on top of Brennan. He swings his mighty hammer once, twice, 3 times. Brennan, with blood on his torso and on his shin, cries out when he sees Gorvis and is inspired to stand back up. He grabs one of the goblins by the jaw and yanks and slams him into 2 other goblins. At this point, Brennan and Gorvis together cry out in unison, a war cry that they've used many times before, and begin the dirty work of finishing off the 12 goblins that they are currently surrounded by. They're able to knock out, or slay 10 of them, and 2 of them run off. Right. With this, Brennan and Gorvis look down at the goblins around them, and then they look over to see Ralna. And they begin to run, but they realize that Ralna will be right under the 12 goblins with the 12 goblins with their stones. At this point, they can do nothing but they actually stop because they realize they're about 80 feet away, and the goblins lift up the stones, and they all look down to see what's going to happen to Ralna. Ralna, they see that Ralna looks at her spell book, places it carefully onto the raft of lumber, and she immediately dives into the water and swims under the lava flow, grabbing the lumber flow, right, and allowing the lumber raft to carry her down river, right, and only after and at this point, Brennan and Gorvis cry out their war cry again, and then begin to descend on the goblins with the stones. The goblins who had just have been trying to get the stones realize their weapons are on the ground, and with the war cry of the other two, even though they're outnumbered, even though the goblins have them outnumbered 6-1, seeing a pack of 10 goblins that were already fallen, already dropped by Gorvis and Brennan, simply run away. Right at that point, Ralna swims out, gets on top, and realizes that none of the boulders while 4 of the boulders had struck the lumber flow, none of them had struck her spell book. Soaking wet and very upset that many of her spell components have been ruined, she brings herself on top of the raft. Brennan and Gorvis run down the river, and actually at that point, they actually have to. So at that point, Ralna again levitates. Ralna does levitate back Gorvis's hammer, and then Brennan and Gorvis swim out to Ralna, and now covered in sweat from the battle, covered in the water from the river. Ralna looking like a wet dog. Gorvis actually takes the time, heals each and every one of them of their wounds, and they continue to float down the river for just a little bit more when Ralna says, "We must take a break. Let's bring the raft onto the shore." And Brennan says, "Well, we're still at least a few more hours away from Castle Edling." And she says, "No, I can take no more risks with my spell book. Bring us to the shore." And so they use the long branch, and they bring themselves to the shore. And that is a verbal short story of fantasy adventure, IronGrove Lumberflow. Let me know your thoughts on my my verbal short story. I'd love to hear your comments in the comment section below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.